computer, and it is recording now. So actually, we are on air when we are being recorded. So thank you all for joining tonight's large-scale Scrum meetup, another virtual session for New York City meetup. Today's session is about, well, the title of it is, and by the way, folks, I apologize if you're not speaking or asking a question. Could you please mute yourself? Today's topic is the hardest part of software product development. Decide what not to build, what to build and what not to build. We have the honor of having Gordon Weir with us, the presenter. He has been with us for more than once or twice over the last year or so. He has been a software developer, a product manager, product owner through his entire career, and he has been very closely attached to large-scale Scrum development at Bank of America Merrill Lynch and in other places. Also was the guest to Craig Larman's training about a year ago, I would say. I'm going to pass the baton over to Gordon to take the floor just in a minute. But before I do, I will also make a quick announcement specifically about Gordon and his upcoming training. There will be something that's coming up in the next couple of weeks, and he will give you more information on that towards the tail end or whenever he wishes, just to briefly mention. And I will also include it in the circulation afterwards. I have been to some of his presentations and deeper dives, and would probably strongly recommend it. In any case, Gordon, I'm going to pass the baton over to you. We have roughly an hour, give or take. You want to budget yourself as you wish. You can either take questions in the interim or ask people to pose them at the end. And I will be picking up what's on the chat. And if something is urgent and pressing, I'll get your attention to it.
Sounds good. Thank you, Gene. Very kind of you. I think quite a few of the names that are attendees on this I've met before or seen at other meetups on less. So it's good to see you again. And for those who I haven't had the pleasure of talking to, welcome. So I really mean this. Less is great. If you want to move to what I consider real agile, implement the deep thinking, the organizational change, the lean thinking, and disruptive elements of agile, and allow it to work at scale, then you can only go to less. So let's give a bit of background on agile. So 20 years ago, almost now, 20 years next year, the snowbird thing happened and agile was born. It shifted software development significantly. It moved us away from big upfront requirements. It strongly encouraged regular interaction with users in the business, and strongly encouraged us to get fast feedback and fail fast. All good stuff. I was actually looking it up earlier on today. 10 years ago, almost to the day as well, the Lean Startup was published. If I was in the room, I'd ask you to put your hands up and tell me who's read that, but I won't. And what that did is shifted the focus from business and users to customer and market feedback. It made the word pivot cool, whereas that used to be called, you've just done a U-turn on our product, and that was considered a bad thing, and suddenly pivoting seemed like a good thing. And then that created a shift towards more modern product development, rapid continuous customer focus, research and discovery, and the use of more scientific methods with customer research. Now, the interesting thing is, and the important thing to consider here, is none of these things replace the other. They all just make each other better. Right? Agile is far better with good product management. Agile is far better with practicing lean, the practices in lean startup. So a bit about me and my background. That ship there was the ship I was actually on at sea for a couple of years. It was HMNZS Wellington in the New Zealand Navy. So I started my career as an officer and an engineering officer in the Navy. Then I left New Zealand and moved to the UK, where I joined PwC and later IBM and was a management consultant. Did years of large-scale system integration, and large-scale software delivery. I'm trying to go through this relatively quickly. I just want to give you a background of who I am. And then after 6 years or so, I wanted to change. I wanted to stop being consultant. I wanted to feel ownership of the software I was delivering and what we're doing and the impact on the business. So I joined UBS. I was determined when I joined UBS to do software development better. I didn't actually like waterfall, but I didn't know what the alternative was when I started at UBS. Since then, I went to Bank of America, and in those two places, I implemented 3 less huge transformations. The one at UBS was used to replace all of the mainframe and the back-end services and systems for equities and prime brokerage processing at UBS. That was a 6-year program of work, and at one stage, I think we had about 150 people working in small feature teams across the globe. And similar scale transformations, actually larger scale transformations, and organizational change at Bank of America. So after 10 years of working in, or more than 10 years, maybe 15 so years working in large enterprises, I decided to move to startups. So more recently, in the last few years, I've been working at Digital Asset and now at Ninth Wave. And in both those companies, I moved away from the technology side and moved into the product delivery and product management side. That was an incredibly steep learning curve and a complete change in career, but a pretty exciting one nonetheless. Let me explain this graph. So this is what happened at UBS. For those of you who have heard me talk in the past, I think this is something you've seen before. But when we started the replacement of the back-end systems for equities, we were using what was called the SUP, which was a version of the Rational Unified Process. It was supposed to be a lightweight version. We had about 6 developers when we started, and then moved to, actually before it was even called SAFE, we met a gentleman named Dean Leffingwell. He'd written a book on large-scale agile, and we had figured that what we're doing with the essential unified process wasn't really working for us going forward. We'd gone away from needing to do inception and elaboration phases to just wanting to continue to deliver software at pace. So we discovered Dean and brought him in. As you can see, that had a positive impact on the amount of change we could do per release. But the releases were fairly well spaced out. They were 6 to 8 weeks apart, I think 8 weeks, and they were named a thing called a release train. And then in about the middle of 2008, we started having serious production issues. The stabilization iteration, or as it was called, the testers were actually ending up sleeping underneath their desks at night because the trains had already stopped going home, so they could try and get the platform stable enough to get into production in 2 weeks. Nonetheless, I was still pretty proud of what we're doing. So I found out a guy named Craig Larman was in London. So I arranged to meet him with a few of my team, and we sat down and I proudly explained how we were building software. He then repeated what I said and explained to me why it wasn't working, which was kind of a shock to me. So after a couple of months of training from Craig and deep thinking, we then transformed the organization to large-scale Scrum. So we self-organized, the team self-selected into feature teams. And as you can see from the point that we implemented large-scale Scrum, the frequency of change and the amount of change that we got in per every release went up by an order of magnitude. Now that isn't all down to less in the organizational change. It is a lot to do with that, but it's also the fact that we were using test-driven development as a matter of course. We're doing acceptance test-driven development. We'd implemented things like specification by example, and had coaches like Gojko coming and teaching us how to do that. So there was a ton of engineering practices and high-end engineering practices that enabled this as well. But the organizational change in the way that we thought about software delivery was significant in terms of how we worked. So all this is good, and this is why you'd use less, and this is the positive side of it, specifically around the engineering principles and practices and how the engineering teams work. So I want to tell you a bit of a story about why it's sometimes not appreciated. I'd love to be able to say who's read this book, but if you haven't read this book, you should. It's about the practices and protocols and patterns that are highly correlated with highly effective teams and high-performing teams. One of the protocols that I use all the time, and specifically I use it for the start of retrospectives, is the check-in protocol. So we were about, should I look at it? Thanks, yeah, it is a good book. So we were about 2 months into a complete shift from what was parallel waterfall delivery. The teams that I'd moved to less were doing 2 weeks of development and roughly 6 weeks of testing before going into production. And we'd move them into getting production ready code every 2 weeks. We went around the retrospective and I'd invited the product owner because I'd heard a few noises that the product owner wasn't exactly happy. So I thought, well, the best thing to do is get this person in to have a retrospective with the teams that are facing off to her. We started around the table, and the concept behind the check-in protocol is you check into a conversation and check into a meeting by opening up about how you're feeling. So you can have primary emotions. You can say, I'm happy, I'm sad, I'm afraid, and then explain why. So we were going around the table. I know it sounds a little bit sort of touchy-feely, but it's a very good way to make sure that people open up in a retrospective. So around the table, a few of the engineers, developers were like, well, I'm happy, but a bit sad that we haven't got this change in yet, etc. And then we got around to the product owner, and she said this. As oh. And then she explained why she felt like that. She said, the teams are always coming to me with problems. It's taking way too much work for me to do this. And it seems to me, since everyone's adopted this new agile stuff, that they seem to have shed and got rid of all of their accountability and responsibility for delivering software, and it seems to now be mine. And she wasn't joking. She was dead serious, and she was extremely angry. I consider this to be a bit of a setback, which is not surprising. I'll be honest with you about that. If she was happy to be that blunt with the people that were working for her and the team and the agile teams, I dreaded to think what she was saying to the rest of the stakeholders and users in the organization that we're in. Obviously, I was a bit confused. We'd implemented this new utopia, right? What could possibly be wrong? We had completely changed the technology organization. We'd removed the silos in technology. We'd created cross-functional teams. We'd re-engineered all of the core systems. Some of the core systems were taking well over a day to build, and we got them down to about 30 minutes. We created a culture where we'd encourage the teams to identify wastes and remove them, and given ownership of the product and direction of the product to the people who use it. This was clearly better in my mind, but it was highly disliked by the people who I figured to be the beneficiaries of the change that we've made. It took me a long time to figure out why. It actually took my more recent change in career to really understand from the other side of the fence, I guess, how it felt to be this person. And what it's come down to, and the main culprit of this pain, is this thing: the product backlog. It looks so innocent though, and it's such a great way to manage work, right? A product backlog. And honestly, it really is. However, it can go very, very wrong. So one of the principles is deciding the backlog priority and clarifying the product sits with the product owner. I personally think that's a great thing, right? The product owner, all the product owner needs to do is prioritize the work, and we deliver on it. We use an empirical process and adjust the backlog based on observational feedback and real feedback. Seems pretty simple. Not only that, the product owner gets to decide the direction of the product and what's in and what's out. They finally have the steering wheel back. They're not passing accountability and responsibility to technology, but they own the direction of it. And when I used to talk about the benefits of moving to Scrum across the various different enterprises that I've worked at, this was always my key selling point. Surely, as users and stakeholders, you want to gain control of what software gets delivered to you. This is another one, the principle, one of the principles of Agile. Business people and developers must work together daily throughout the project. Music to my ears, music to everyone's ears, right? What could be better than engineers getting out of their shell and getting out of their buildings and going to talk to the product owner and users? I'm never going to be an artist, but there's my little picture. I mean, who doesn't want a team of 7 people in their office asking questions that you can't really answer when you've got a line roll to do? And the question, we've sort of been taught to ask questions like, can you explain how this process works? And how do you see the market changing? And what's your acceptance criteria for this story? Another thing, you might have seen this picture or seen an article by Jeff Patton on this very thing. As that list of stories, and they always get bigger and bigger and longer builds up, they become more and more fine-grained. The forest of big features and capabilities we dreamed of delivering seems to start to look like this, just a big pile of leaves. And that pile of leaves is incredibly hard to prioritize. Take it from me, actually. Even it's hard to see what's being done in order to deliver, what needs to be done in order to deliver a meaningful feature for our users. Jeff comes up with a pretty cool way of dealing with this story mapping. But this is a primary problem. And then because of all of that, a product backlog actually starts to look like one of these. Don't look at it too closely. I'll just cut and paste this out of Google. But we end up in a position where the team, whilst working in an agile way, is really just chipping through a list of already committed to features and stories. Now, there's still benefit in that, of course. There's regular builds, regular batches, feedback, working code, etc. But ultimately, it's just a march towards some sort of endpoint. Now, to be clear, and this is really important, this is not the intention of Scrum, Agile, or less to end up like this, but it is more often than not how it does, even with the best intentions. So let's look at this in a different way. Gojko is a good friend of mine now, and I would say one of the best and deepest thinkers about software quality in the industry. He authored the books on specification by example, impact mapping, and a whole lot more. And now has pulled back from that entirely and is writing software products. There's one called MindMump, which is an excellent online mind mapping tool, which he wrote entirely on his own. I pulled this picture out of an article he wrote, which aligns quality of software and quality of products to Maslow's hierarchy of being, which I'm sure all of you know. And it's an excellent way to think about software, in my opinion. So first you want to know, and the most important facet of any software is, can you actually build it and deploy it? And does it functionally do what you've asked it to do, right? So does it work? Next thing you want to check is that software performant? Is it secure? What's its capacity, etc. Then can someone actually use it? Can someone navigate through it and use that software? And then is that thing useful for me? Does it even do a job? And then most important, especially for the product developer, does that thing make money for me? Because you can be all of those things, but not make any money. It ends up becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy and failing anyway. Now, most backlogs tend to focus right there on functionality and potentially on deployability. And more often than not, actually, product engineering teams are measured and they report on outputs rather than outcomes. Therefore, they maximize the delivery of more and more software, chipping through that myriad of leaves in their backlog. But a backlog doesn't generally focus on what is important, which is successful usefulness and success, and the success of that product for the company you work for. I mean, it's kind of weird, but I've noticed a trend that there's no one given the power to delete, or very few people are given the power to delete the story out of Jira, because the idea of removing something from this enormous backlog seems too frightening. Good, excellent. Okay, so there's two truths about software products, and neither of them are very nice. This is from an article by Marty Kagan, but it's empirical, so it's true. So half of our ideas are not going to work. In fact, it goes up to 75% of our ideas are not going to work. So they either won't be considered useful, they won't be taken up, and they won't earn any money. And even when those ideas do prove to be valuable. Hello?
Gordon, you're spotty. You came and you went, but I think it's okay now.
Okay, good. Yeah, if someone's got a question, that's fine. Ask it now. I'd rather wait till the end because I'm not near the punchline yet. Typically, it takes several iterations. In fact, always it takes several iterations for an idea or a product idea get to a point where it delivers unexpected value to a company. So I've given you all of the bad news. So now what? And it took me a long time to really figure this out. As I said, a complete change in career and an incredibly steep learning curve. So we need to shift more towards customer and user-centric thinking and discovery. You'll notice I've avoided two words, the words product and management in this statement. And why? Because obviously, part of what I'm talking about here is product management. Because if we focus on a product, then we're not focused on what's actually important, which is weird considering that our role is often product manager or product owner. So this is a product, and it's cool, right? An electric drill. I need to have an electric drill with a 1/4-inch bit. I could add new features to this thing, cool new features. I could add a battery pack or whatever. And actually, this is a new product as well. But actually, what I need is this. I need a 1/4-inch hole. Now, sort of narrow thinking would be you need an electric drill to get yourself a 1/4-inch hole. But prior to an electric drill, it used to be done with a hand drill. And then just thinking about it, until Uber, the way to get about without driving was to call a taxi, and which is always a pretty overwhelming experience. And Uber owns no cars. Until the Airbnb, the only way to stay in a city really was in a hotel. Sometimes great, often not. Airbnb owns no property. It will always be a disruptive way to do the job you need to get done. And if you're not looking for it as a product manager, looking out in the market and doing research, then your product will almost definitely be destroyed. Interesting couple of factoids. 60% of the Fortune 500 companies from the 70s don't exist anymore. And who saw the iPod or the iPhone coming? I'd say Nokia certainly didn't. So I love this quote by Reed. Netflix is probably one of the best product companies out there. And it really sums up thinking about product and organization. So when I started down the road of product management and product process, this is sort of how I saw the product process, and this is certainly how we saw the product process whilst working in an enterprise. Is we came up with a set of ideas, we had a strategy, something we wanted to achieve, i.e. replacing the mainframe for equities, because that would save us a lot of money, $50-odd million per annum, which is certainly worth going after. And then we'd try and figure out an MVP and a plan and a roadmap, and then start building it. We'd do very little research or very little talking to users to understand how they were using that product or what was valuable to them or what was valuable to the market, and then continue through the cycle. Basically, listening to I don't know if you've heard of the term HIPPO, but the highest paid person in the room makes the decisions, and then the rest of us execute on them, obviously hoping for the right outcome. But actually what we want is a process that looks more like this, which is the scientific method, where we're continually evolving our understanding of the product, where the MVP turns into development. And you break that development into stories, just like we normally do. So let me talk about this in a different way. So once we've delivered our software, we then measure it. We want to get the software into production fast and measure everything you can. As a product manager or someone in product space or anyone working in product, you should be literally drowning in data. If you're not, you need to go look for it. If you can't get data out of the system on use metrics, which often is the case, especially in internal systems, there's no reason why not, then go out and find it. Use surveys, ask questions, go and do user research, look at users using the platform, sit and watch them, get non-users to try and use the software. And then look at business metrics as well, like if you're in a product space, ARR, NRR, and customer lifetime value. The truth is there's a 100% probability that users will have a problem with your product, and probably a big one. You just need to find it using these metrics. For example, and this is one from Netflix, in fact, they found out that the cancel rates, the subscription cancel rates went up significantly at the start of every summer. But that's all it told them. It didn't tell them why, and you could probably guess why or have some try and figure out hypotheses, but it went up at the start of every summer. So once you know that your product has a problem and it's not being used in the way that you expect or not adding value, then you need to start exploring why. So the metrics only tell you that it's something's directionally incorrect. You need to find out what is actually happening. So again, more user research, interviews, looking at doing things like usability research, going and talking to people and talking to the users. It's kind of a frightening thing, talking to customers, and then figuring out what's happening. Turns out in the Netflix case that people felt guilty about binge watching television in the summer period when they should be outside, so they cancelled the subscription. Kind of makes sense. Once you understand the problem in more detail, then you need to discover how to address that problem. Maybe it can't even be solved. Maybe what you've delivered is not useful at all, in which case you need to pivot and figure out what does deliver value. The way we do this is by building prototypes or wireframes or mock-ups, whatever makes sense to discover what to do, and then use focus groups to see how they use the platform and use the software to see whether or not it solves the problem that you've identified. Then there's things like concierge and Wizard of Oz techniques. So concierge means we take on the problem for them. So an example of that might be, say our product involves editing and listing videos. Say you're doing, your software is about training courses, and teachers are putting videos online to explain their course. You may find that this isn't happening as much as you'd like, or there's not many courses being listed. So you could take on the job of taking raw video and editing it and bringing it up online for them. That's concierge. That's we do the job for the end users to understand whether there's a market or there's a need to change the product in order to make it simpler and easier to use, or even buying one, so like buying an editing tool and adding it to your product. Wizard of Oz is kind of obvious. Basically, behind the nice looking front end, you're pedaling and doing what you need to make the software work. So more often than not, a new commerce site might look slick on the front end, but the back end, all of the fulfillment and logistics is managed through email and manually. Many highly successful online companies have started this way, and then when they know that there's a genuine market, they start automating the fulfillment and logistics processes. A/B testing is more heavyweight and a lot more expensive, in that you need to build quite large chunks of the product and the process in order to test it. And also you need a user base that's sizable enough to be able to figure out whether or not the changes are significant. It's true that if certain websites you keep refreshing, you'll often end up with a price test and you might get a better price. So that's kind of worth doing, and it's a helpful hint, because A/B testing with things like Netflix is happening all the time. And sometimes you just need to go with your gut feel, what you think might be right, and building it, but that isn't the ideal. So let's look at this again in a different way. What are we trying to discover? So a product has at least four key risks, and these are the big ones. One, you need to figure out whether the product is delivering value. For example, does this product give me my quarter-inch hole? Does it make my life better? Is it even usable? Is it easy to grasp? There's a stat out there that if you can't figure out how to use an iPhone app within about 30 seconds, the users will delete it. So it needs to be well thought through and well designed. Feasibility. So can it even be built? Have we got the talent? Have we got the skill? Have we got the technology to build it? If not, don't start. And does it? And benefits is key as well. Many companies have been highly successful in terms of the amount of growth, but they haven't built a product that generates revenue, and therefore the end result is just as bad. So the interesting thing with discovery is we're trying to find the idea, the feature that's hiding here. So it's kind of a eureka moment. Awesome. It's my awesome little feature sits just in that intersection of all of those risks. And only then, when you know that what you're building is going to deliver on, and manage the risks, do you put it into your backlog and get on to develop it. Now, the interesting thing with development is it's highly expensive. Production code, no matter what software development technique you're using, is expensive. It needs to be deployed, it needs to be maintained. It more often than not will need to be security tested. It probably needs performance testing, and it probably needs more. Having been through a recent initial release of a product, what we thought was going to take a couple of weeks ended up taking a month and a half to get the infrastructure ready to deploy it. It's never as easy as you'd like, and always far more expensive than you'd like. This is where the backlog comes together. So let's put all this together. Back to my friend Jeff Patton. He called it dual track development. So what this is rapidly finding and discovering what needs to be built for the product, killing ideas that don't work, exploring ideas in as many different ways as possible until you find a backlog item that goes into the development cycle. So this is about learning. This is about developing production-ready code. When you think about it in this way, it's an awful lot to put on the product owner, especially when that person has a primary job of managing a business function. So the sorts of knowledge and skills that is necessary to be a good product manager or product owner is understanding of finance, being able to do research, data analysis, planning, being able to communicate, understanding software and technology. One of the biggest skills in my mind is the ability to say no, having domain knowledge, understanding the business, understanding the market, having facilitation skills, etc., etc. When you think about that, product discovery, design, and delivery is a multi-skilled and highly complex activity. It has to be a team sport. So, interestingly enough, the genesis of Scrum was a paper written in 1986 called the New Product Development Game, and it was a research paper executed by the Harvard Business School, but commissioned by the US government to try and understand why countries like Japan were able to produce rapidly improve and change their products at a pace that far outstripped most US product companies. And what they found is the teams that were the product companies that were most successful were the product companies that had multidisciplined, multi-skilled, cross-functional team members in them. And these team members did everything. They did the market research. One of the examples in the paper is about the development of the Honda City car. And Honda they wanted to build a car that was targeted at the youth market, the 20-year-olds. So they actually got a team of designers, engineers, production engineers, etc., who were all in their early 20s. And this team spent months researching cars that were predominantly used by young people, and they ended up designing a car largely based on the Mini, a very upright-looking car. But they did everything. They designed, they prototyped, they did market research, and they implemented the production line for the Honda City car. They didn't sit there and wait for a product owner to decide what items to put at the top of their product backlog. Like I said, it's a highly complex activity. The product owner is there for a primary purpose. The product owner is there to lead, make final decisions, and understand where the market's going and drive the teams. So I'm hoping there's lots of questions. I'm hoping that sort of sums up why I found all of my LESS implementations to be both great and sometimes underappreciated, and what I've discovered since then as to what can make them better. I'm open for questions, Gene.
Well, the floor is open, folks, so I don't see any questions in the queue at the moment. So maybe you can just, shoot at, shoot at will. If you have any questions for Gordon, or any, doesn't have to be a question, maybe it's just a comment. Please do share back.
Okay, I'll give one a go.
Alan, thank you.
Let's see, let me turn on my video. Here we go. Can you see me yet?
Yep. And a
Yep.
big
Hi,
shelf.
Gordon.
Yeah.
So
We've met before, haven't we? I'm sure we have.
I don't think so, but
Oh,
I'm delighted to meet you now.
You guys don't know each other?
No.
Great. Well, you're worth each other, so say hi.
Hello. So Gordon, I understand now you've moved into PM role. And I have two questions. The first question is, what is the thing that surprised you the most in moving into that responsibility?
Yep. Do you want to ask the next one, or should I answer that one first?
I'll ask it so you can noodle on it. That is, there's so many different prioritization schemes and practices and techniques. And of course, they're going to vary depending on the type of product you're working in and the company size. But with where you are now, have you found a couple that seem to be a sweet spot for where your product is at this point?
Yeah, look, so let's start with the first one. What was most surprising? I remember I used to have this saying, which I regret now, but sometimes you do that, right? So I used to say to the business and the users that, look, I've built this really, really amazing engine, right? And it's highly tuned. And, that picture I showed early on of the graph of just how much change we could do so quickly, you're not feeding it fast enough. So it was an accusation towards the business and the product ownership group, which often was sort of like quasi-analysts anyway, that they just weren't producing requirements fast enough, right? Probably not surprising, but really was just how hard that is, right? And how hard keeping ahead of the team is. I sort of, because I'm in a small startup, I'm kind of everything here. I'm Scrum Master, product owner, I clean the dishes, whatever I need to do to get the job done. So I always surprise myself by, oh, crikey, I've got a backlog refinement session tomorrow, and I'm not ready, right? I just haven't even thought about it right now, right? And that's why I started thinking about there must be a better way to do this, right? And that's when I started talking to Jeff Patton and saying, product management is scaring me. I really don't get it. And he said, look, it's about things like discovery and working closely with a team to discover what needs to be built, not necessarily just managing a list of things to do. Right? Mm-hmm. And look, I always use things like story mapping. I love it, right? You produce a big list of stuff, but then it's always refining and thinking about what it means. And actually the refinement and thinking about what it means is a team sport, not a one single person sport. So just how hard it was and how surprisingly quick the next product refinement and planning sessions come up was surprising to me. And then prioritization schemas. I've tried everything, that Craig taught us, language. So you sort of have different factors and then put the backlog items in and you score them and it's sort of, blah, blah, blah. Kind of pointless in that actually the one I've come across recently, which I absolutely love, is thinking about what's important to the company at a strategic level. And I didn't talk too much about product strategy, but actually without a product strategy and a metric and a North Star metric, I didn't. The purpose of this talk wasn't about strategy, but maybe I should have wrapped it in. But I'm glad you asked the question. There's a model which Gibson Biddle introduced me to, which is called GEM, which is growth, engagement, or monetization. So what is the current strategic direction of the company and therefore the products? Is it to grow, which is sell more product, get more customers, etc.? Is it to engage current customers and grow the business with them, right? Or is it to monetize what you've got and squeeze as much as you can? And the only reason you really do monetization, in my mind, would be prior to IPOs, etc., right? But certainly growth and engagement, and then having that high level prioritization model allows everything else it makes everything else simple, right? If what you're trying to do is about growth, then the team, because product management really and product management and delivery is really a team sport, can figure out the best things to do and the most rapid way to get there in order to grow the business. If in my space at the moment is open banking API type stuff, our belief is growing the business, and we know it now, is by getting a two-sided market, getting as many applications connected to our APIs as possible, because that becomes extremely attractive to the consumers of our product. Right? Mm-hmm. So the more we can connect, the better we are. Mm-hmm. But that's the growth. So thinking about it at fine-grained, how do we prioritize this story over this story? It's kind of meaningless, really. And if you're delivering all the time, why bother? There might be a sequence you need in terms of technical dependencies, but at that level, I just don't see the point. And you shouldn't really have that many stories in your backlog anyway. It should be just the next release and the next focus based on what you now need to do with the strategy. And it's all too easy to have several hundred items in a backlog that just sit there and rot. When I was at Merrill's, we had items that have been there for several years, and we weren't allowed to delete them. Right? And I don't know why. Did that answer your question? Sorry, long way to answer, but certainly.
Yeah, it did. And like one of the companies I'm working for, I guess it leads to this as a product leader now. When you're in a high growth, I don't know, you're in a startup, right now, is that right?
Yep.
So with like a company I'm working with that's a high growth company that really needs to shift from revenue driven to be product driven. Mm-hmm. Looking at growth and engagement more and stop obsessing about the revenue from the CEO and his directs. Having the leadership shift from revenue to product driven is, I don't know if you have any suggestions on that.
It's an easy trap to fall into, right? The sales driven.
Yeah.
And it's not an easy one to get out of, because you often find yourself chasing your tail because we've committed to a client something that we haven't got in the product yet, which happens. The approach I use is and it seems to work with everything, is over communicate. So I have a weekly session and many calls with sales where we talk about what's in the product, what we can demonstrate, what's going to be in the product, and the roadmap. And actually, we collectively built the product strategy. I collectively built the product strategy with the sales team and engaged them all the way through that process. Yeah. And there's a really nice couple of techniques which I've learned to build out a really rapid product strategy that can buy everyone in. That talks about the behavioral benefits and the positioning of your product, right, which is kind of intrinsic with marketing and sales, and then turning that into a set of obviously a key North Star metric, and then a set of strategic goals for the product over the next 12 months with proxy metrics that link back to the North Star metric. And then you put together a roadmap that isn't a commitment. It's a set of ways that we believe, or tactics we could believe, that will achieve a movement of those proxy metrics to shift the North Star metric that everyone theoretically is bought into by bringing them through the journey. Mm-hmm. Works really well. It's quite a cool technique. It's in my course if you want to come join it.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. Thank you.
Any other questions? Oh, great questions too. Thanks.
Yeah. Gordon, let me actually ask one, but let's give others an opportunity to ask first. Anyone? Maybe I have one that's kind of, I would say, pressing, not pressing, but something on
just ask it in case it sparks some other thoughts as well, Gene.
Yeah, let me just shoot one. So all these grading. So you mentioned some of these engineering practices that you have implemented. There's a saying that we often use, that you cannot fix challenges of organizational design with even the most advanced, the most modern agile engineering practices. So I'm alluding to you as the software engineer, also as someone who understands technology, and of course, someone who has been around various companies of various lines of business. and obviously having seen some of the organizational dynamics, what are your personal experiences like implementing TDD, ATDD, CI/CD pipeline, code ownership, stuff that is, and it's just really good. I mean, not necessarily agile practice, is just a good engineering practice.
They're enablers, right? So a couple of stories. So when I turned up at Merrill's, we discovered some of the core processing platforms took over a day to compile and build and deploy. Right? Now, if you're trying to get to a place where production-ready code is possible in two weeks, then so it's a bit of chicken and egg to your statement, right? Then without fixing that build time of those, and they're pretty old platforms, right? They're existing products that the company had bought, and they were they were core processing engines, right? Without changing that, trying to shift to sprints and feature teams would have been almost pointless, right? Because if you're trying to get, how much coding could you do if every time you wanted to test whether or not what you'd done was effective and achieved the feature that you're trying to build took over a day to figure out, then there'd be next to nothing done per sprint, right? And one of the beauties of things like Agile and Scrum is that I like the statement, it holds a mirror up to your organization, right? So where people say, look, Agile doesn't work for us, what they're actually saying is we're not good enough to do it, right? Our software isn't good enough, our practices aren't good enough. What I found with things like TDD is the only way that it becomes intrinsic in the organization is to have people within the organization that genuinely know how to do it and are almost evangelical about it, right? They absolutely believe in it, right? To just do a training course or say, let's do TDD now, nothing will change, right? And also if you're going to introduce it if you can afford it with the best people possible. So I don't know if you guys have, Gojko created a TDD course for us, highly successful, really changed the way people thought about building software and how long, TDD really is not about test driven. It's funny how many people put that in their resumes and can't explain to me what it means. It's about a cultural shift, right? So you check out the code, you write one unit test, you write the code to get the unit test to pass, and then you check it back in, and that should take you, anywhere between 5 and 20 minutes. That is a significant change in the people's mindset for software development, right? So does it take organizational change to make that true? Kind of, Gene. But you certainly need a cultural shift, right? And that probably is driven, and almost definitely is driven by the need for organizational change, because the organization dictates the culture based on how it's structured.
That's the proxy variable, if you will. That culture is a proxy variable of structure.
Yeah. Culture is an output, right? Culture is an output of the organization, the way you work, and the people in the organization. It's not an input.
Yeah. That answers my question. Yeah, I just wanted to validate some of my assumption as well, and oftentimes seeing.
Absolutely have to embed developers in the teams that are believers in it, and eventually everyone does it. The interesting thing is that I noticed an interesting behavior. Is it interesting? Kind of observational behavior is if you think about a learning curve of a developer, and TDD is sort of like one of the extreme levels of development. They start to set that as the bar for anyone joining the organization. So they end up testing people in their ability to do test-driven development before they'll employ them, which in my mind is a mistake, because it's actually very rare that organizations use test-driven development effectively, and therefore you're excluding yourself from a vast pool of people who are actually really good developers. They just don't happen to have been exposed to proper TDD yet, right? So it sort of becomes this. The organizational change creates this arrogance as well, which you need to watch out for.
Yeah, that's a good answer. Thank you for clarifying this to me. For me. Anyone else that may have questions for Gordon? We you have almost the same number of people we started with. Only one person dropped. Anyone else?
Yeah, hi. This is Tamer speaking from Toronto. Thank you, Gordon, for the talk, and Gene for setting this up.
Sure.
Gordon, you pointed out that you rarely find a product owner who doesn't have actual business or functional job to be done.
Mm-hmm.
How did you do you have any successful techniques with dealing with that? Because that I'm finding that as well very commonplace. My second question, so I have two questions, is I did jump in late on this call though. You mentioned that you feel some of your less implementations were underappreciated. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, sure. So first, with dealing with product owners who are busy, and the second one, underappreciated. Right? Okay, cool. So first question, they're always going to be busy, right? Because at the end of the day, they speak. So Tamer, what sort of organization do you work in? Do you work in an organization where your software is used by internal people to enable the product, or are you building a software product that's sold? Or
So I work for a consultancy. So what we do is we go work with clients, right? And we chase their product owners. So that's a very typical problem that we find. And we try to coach them on how to pick the product owner, but it's almost never ideal. So then you have to deal with what you've got. And so I was wondering, like, if you have any successful experience or how to reach a balance at least.
So I guess my answer to both your questions is coupled, right? In that the reason that I have found less to be underappreciated is because the product owners feel set upon, right? Because they've suddenly, their workload, what they used to be able to do is give a vague description of what they wanted and what outcomes they wanted. And technology in the waterfall model would go away and try and understand that and talk to users and do analysis and create a specification. And then the product owner or sponsor or stakeholder would get a hold of that, have a read through it, ask lots of questions, give feedback. There'd be a lot of to and fro between the business and technology, agreeing dates and scope and all that sort of stuff, right? And then we'd sign it. And then technology would own the delivery of that thing, and accountability would be successfully passed to technology to deliver the scope of this specification. Now, Agile's job is to try and address that and shift the balance back to the business, where it's a continual feedback loop, far more successful. There's a far higher probability of software success and product success doing that. But what it also does is shift a lot of work back to that product owner, right? And more often than not, they used to, up until the point that this agile transformation happened, have a day job where they thought about what was happening with software once every couple of weeks and maybe once a month when they went to a thing called a steering committee and they had a conversation about it. And then they could either worry about it or not and go back to their day job, right? So what we're asking them to do is a significantly larger amount of work, right? And what we tend to do when we do a transformation and move to like Scrum is we push all of that work in their direction, and the team doesn't engage, in my mind, enough on the direction of the product and what it means. And actually, the whole premise behind a feature team, as it's described in the new product development game, which Ken and Jeff used as a genesis to design the concept of Scrum back in '98 or whatever, is that team collectively works on designing, describing, discovering, and shaping the product, right? And the product owner really is there to be the final arbiter and the decision maker in that instance, rather than the person who has to do all the work and the prioritization and everything else. So I think it's underappreciated, undervalued, because the team becomes, well, just tell us what to do and we'll do it. And that's never was the concept behind Scrum and Agile and how we need to work, right? And hence things like the lean startup and product discovery as described by Marty Kagan and stuff is getting so much traction because it's shifting that culture towards a team-based and a more collective way of discovering the product and what needs to be built. So the reason it's underappreciated is because suddenly these people feel hit upon. You know, I know I've got a lot of friends who work on the business side who despair of teams going to Scrum and Agile because it's like, what the heck just happened there, right? And why did they do that, right? Now, what are they expecting me to do? Every 2 weeks, tell them what they need to work on? No. And it's sort of, the balance went too far the wrong way in my mind. And hence the reason, whilst the engineering practices, the software practices are far better, the impact on the effective beneficiaries of it is quite high, and often seriously underappreciated and not understood, and hence the statement at the start of my talk. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, mostly. I guess it's ruffles their feathers, and so then it's underappreciated.
Yeah, and they get dumped on, right? And that's actually not what the idea of the idea of it was. Never that, right? It was never, well, just tell us what to do next and prioritize the backlog and use some sort of prioritization model to tell us what to do next. And you need to write the stories. And it's just no. The team does all of that, right? The team writes the stories. The team understands the product. The team works with product management to understand what to do next.
Fair enough. Okay.
Sorry, carry on. Ask your question.
Sorry, I was just going to follow up on my first question. So what I was saying is I was just wondering if you've had any successful conversations with people on the PO assignment where you talk maybe with leadership and try to convince them that, you know, to assign a PO, he might be the most knowledgeable about a certain product or a certain way of work, but he's very busy, so he probably shouldn't be the PO, or if he should be the PO, then some of his time needs to be freed up.
Anything that every transformation like this needs leadership buy-in, but also it shouldn't necessarily be that much more work. And the interesting thing with a product owner or a product manager, especially within an enterprise, is let's step back a bit. Even before Agile was a thing, right? There was a company called the Standish Group that's still around, right, Gene, I think, that used to, the Standish Group did those chaos surveys and stuff, right?
No.
And they correlated highly successful, the most likely, the factors that cause the most likely success for projects, right? So they'd look at like 3,000 to 5,000 successful software product deliveries, and then 3,000 to 5,000 unsuccessful ones, and they correlated the things that were causing the projects to fail, and correlated the things that were most likely to cause success. And always, the number one for successful projects was a fully bought-in stakeholder, someone who passionately wanted that software to be delivered and was completely bought in, right? Now that person is actually who we're after to be the product owner, right? The person who is passionate about that software and genuinely believes in the product that it's going to deliver, right? Now, if your product owner is reluctant and isn't that person that's passionate about it but just has some knowledge, it's the wrong person, right? And you need to find the right one, and someone who's genuinely passionate about the software product being delivered.
Oh, great answer. Thanks a lot.
Yeah. Because otherwise it's just a business analyst or something, or someone who knows the line job better than most, in which case they're a useful user to talk to, but they're not, or subject matter expert, but they're not a product owner.
Perfect.
And I'd almost use the word sponsor in that conversation. Who's really going to sponsor this? Because that's the product owner. And by the way, they don't have to do a lot of work. They just have to be involved in discussions while we discuss what we think we should be doing with the product and decide on A versus B. That's it. They shouldn't be looking at a backlog or anything like that at all. Right? The backlog is a team thing.
Thanks a lot.
We are on the half. We're exactly at 1 hour mark, Gordon, everyone. So I want to make sure that you're cognizant of that. So we do have some extra time if you would like. That is, if there are any questions. If not, I'm going to remind once again. So Gordon, maybe you want to give just a 30-second, 1 minute replay of what you're planning to do in the next couple of weeks. I think you were doing something.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So you've got my details there. I'll update my website as well with the details. But I have created a product strategy and discovery course. It's all about how to do this. It's a 2-day course. It's very hands-on, very practical. It'll teach you how to develop a product strategy and roadmap with workable metrics that you can communicate internally and bring people on board with. So the first day will be spent designing the product idea, potentially, or using your own product and evolving a strategy and a roadmap for it. And then the second day is all about discovery techniques. So how to do user interviews, how to do user research, and how to fold that into software delivery. And then also about being a product manager. So it's a combination of everything I've learned over the last 20-something years, compressed into 2 days. I think it's a really exciting course. So I will send the link afterwards.
Yeah, thanks for sharing this. Pass on to me whatever you got, and I'll share with your deck. I'm sure. And usually people ask if the deck will be shared. We have the audio, the video, so that should do it. But also the deck.
Yeah, sure. I'll make a PDF and spit it out.
To others. Yeah. Well, I mean, still the floor is open, guys. Going once, going twice. Anyone has any last minute question or remark? It's Karam has a funny light hanging there.
Yeah, I know. I've been watching what's going on. I've seen a hand move around. Yeah.
I'm not sure what that is. Yeah, he's doing something. Okay. All right, cool.
Okay. Thanks, guys.
So, guys, thank you very much for joining. I will, so first of all, thank you. Goodbye. I'm going to stop recording. So anyone wants to say thank you, do it now before I stop recording.
Yeah, thank you so much, and sorry about the light thing. I didn't know I turned the camera on. And
no, it's all good. We were excited to see it.
Thanks.
Okay, folks.
Thanks very much for organizing, Gene, and thanks for.
This is adjourned. Yep, thank you, Gordon. Cheers.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.
Bye. And stop recording.